me introduce to you now Hugh Mackay, author of The Art of Belonging. Hugh Mackay is a social researcher and the author of 16 books, including most recently The Good Life, a 2013 bestseller, and his 6th novel, Infidelity. He is a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and the recipient of several honorary doctorates from Australian universities. He lives in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. The Art of Belonging advances the argument put forward in Mackay's best-selling The Good Life, that a good life is not lived in isolation or in the pursuit of independent goals. A good life is lived at the heart of a thriving community amongst people we trust and within an environment of mutual respect. So, amen to that. This sounds absolutely fascinating. So please join me in making Hugh feel that he belongs.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Come and hover with me in a helicopter above Southwood. What do you see? At first glance, it looks pretty formless, doesn't it? Just another vast suburban sprawl. Could be anywhere, really. It almost looks like a caricature of a suburb, a stereotype. Standard 3-bedroom housing stock dominates, sliced and diced, row upon row, so similar as to appear homogeneous from this height. Unrelieved by much vegetation, though there are thousands of front lawns and backyards down there, many with swimming pools and a few playing fields and parks dotted about. Yet if we were to swoop low over Southwood, low enough to glimpse the lives being lived under all these red roofs, low enough to sense what's really going on here, we'd get a very different impression. Southwood, like every place of human habitation, is a rich and complex cultural phenomenon. Yes, it's one of those much maligned suburbs. But aren't the suburbs where most poems are written, most cups of sugar borrowed, most flowers grown, most dreams fulfilled, most passions stirred, most sexual relationships consummated, most babies conceived, most marriages celebrated? It's the suburbs where most parents feel those primitive surges of joy, swelling like silken banners in the heart. The suburbs are where faith is most often tested by experience, and where the most painful lesson of all, that love's work is hard work, is usually learnt. Suburbs are where the joy of sex is most often experienced and its disappointments most often faced, where most intimations of mortality are first detected, and where a feeling of contentment, yearned for yet unexpected, most often descends on people. This is not because suburbs are better or worse places to live than anywhere else. All those things happen in country towns too. They happen in inner city terraces and apartments, in caravan parks and fishing villages. But the suburbs have the numbers, which is to say, most life happens in the suburbs. Well, that's a little glimpse of Southwood, a suburb which of course doesn't exist. Check your postcode book. But it does exist in my imagination, and it's a suburb that I created out of years of listening to people talking about life in the suburbs where they live. And I used Southwood as a kind of social laboratory for this new book, which, although it is non-fiction, it's a work of social analysis, trying to come to grips with what's happening in neighbourhoods and communities all over Australia. The social analysis is constantly illustrated and supported, and I hope illuminated, by stories from the lives of the people who live in Southwood. And Southwood is a very typical example of how the vast majority of Australians, and indeed the vast majority of Westerners, live. We live in cities and suburbs and towns and villages because that's the way social creatures prefer to live. Aren't you sick of being told how selfish we all are? Aren't you tired of biologists and others saying that it's our kind of biological duty to satisfy our own urges and seek our own ends, that everything we do is ultimately self-interested, even when we appear to be behaving in an altruistic way? It's not really altruistic. It's just us trying to look good in the eyes of other people or make ourselves feel better by doing something that seems altruistic. And of course, there is some truth in that proposition that humans can be very competitive, very self-absorbed, and can behave aggressively and even violently towards other people who stand in their way. But that is not the deepest truth about human beings. It's not the deepest truth about any of you. And the life of Southwood, as a little microcosm of life in Perth or anywhere else around Australia, is the proof that that's not the deepest truth about us. The deepest and the sweetest truth about human nature is that we are by nature, in our essence, built into our DNA, we are cooperative creatures. Like so many other species on Earth, we need each other. We're hopeless in isolation. We need communities to sustain us and support us and protect us. Neuroscientists are starting to say, and of course they're probing the brain in ways unknown in human history until now. They're starting to say you can find the cooperative centre in the human brain, but you can't find the competitive centre. Competition is something we learn as we go through childhood, but our innate nature is to live in harmony, to live cooperatively. In other words, to live as members of herds. We're herd animals. We're tribal creatures. But the other great truth about humans, and it won't have escaped your attention, is that not all communities are sweetness and light, and not all communities survive. In fact, human history is littered, even recent Australian history is littered with examples of communities that have fallen apart. And so the beautiful symmetry of human society, the beautiful symmetry of human nature is that we humans, who so desperately need each other for mutual support and sustenance through communities, must in turn nurture and sustain those communities that nurture and sustain us, or they may fragment, they may just diminish, they may just fall apart. So it's not just sad, but it's biologically serious when you hear people say things like, I don't know my neighbours. When you hear people, as you do in most of our cities and suburbs around Australia, in some cases, hearing people say things like, I feel like a stranger in my own street. Or, a common cry among older Australians, the neighbourhood doesn't seem to work like a community in the way I seem to remember from years ago. Well, is it true that the neighbourhood isn't working like a community in the way that it used to? Why would it be the case that it's almost a cliche, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, almost a cliche that people will say we don't really know our neighbours, or literally we don't know our neighbours' names? It sounds surprising, and yet just step back for a moment and take a look at what we've all been living through over the last 30 or 40 years. Take a look at what's been happening in contemporary Australian society over these past few decades. Look at the social changes, look at the cultural changes, the economic changes, the technological changes that have really been quite radically redefining what kind of society we are and reshaping the way we live. And I think you might be driven to the conclusion that most of these changes, taken together, most of these changes will have the tendency, it's not guaranteed as an outcome, but will have the tendency to destabilise local neighbourhoods and communities, to fragment families, to make more of us than ever before in Australian social history feel a bit socially isolated or even alienated and excluded. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time this afternoon talking about those changes, but I do want to run through a quick summary, a short list of just some of the more obvious changes that have been reshaping us in this way, and then let's look at what the likely effects of these changes might be. You all know about these changes because you've all lived through them, and many of you will have helped to drive these changes. For example, the radical change in our patterns of marriage and divorce. You only have to go back 40 years, which is not that long, to a time when divorce was a really unusual thing in Australian society. Only about 8 or 9% of marriages ever ended in divorce. Today, around 35% of contemporary marriages will end in divorce. A huge social revolution. We don't have this alone, of course. Many other countries have levels of divorce comparable to that. But the impact, given the context of what we're talking about this afternoon, the impact is not just on the couples who separate and divorce, and it's usually unpleasant. It's always unpleasant. It's usually traumatic for those couples, but also for their families, for their friendship circles, and even for the neighbourhoods that they inhabit. And of course, if kids are involved, it's destabilising for the kids as well. In Australia now, perhaps rather surprisingly, we have 1 million dependent kids who live with just one of their natural parents. And half of those kids, 500,000 kids, this weekend almost certainly, most of them will be engaged in that part of that regular migration that happens between the home of the custodial parent and the home of the non-custodial parent. From the point of view of the sense of the stability and cohesiveness of local neighbourhoods, that change alone introduces an element of instability and uncertainty, particularly for those 500,000 kids who are constantly moving between one micro-community and another. And while we're talking about kids, let's look at another one of the radical reshaping changes. We're living with the lowest birth rate in our history. That's not strictly true. It has gone up a little bit in the last couple of years. People are now talking about a mini baby boom at the moment. Well, it's all right as long as you shout mini and whisper boom. The birth rate is about 1.8 babies per woman. It's staggered up in the last few years from 1.7 to 1.8. Replacement level is 2.1. And a baby boom, we had one of those in the late 50s in the late 40s and through the 50s to the early 60s. In those 15 years after the end of World War II, we had a real baby boom when the birth rate was 3.6 babies per woman. We're currently operating at half that birth rate. I don't personally think of that as a boom. I think of that as a hiccup in a slow and steady decline. Well, the birth rate as it now is means that we Australians are currently producing, relative to total population, we're currently producing the smallest generation of children Australia has ever produced. The generation with the quietest voice, the smallest footprint of any generation in our history. Now, we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about the implications of that and why, for example, so many parents are now over-parenting the kids they've got because there are so few of them. Not that when people had 4 or 5 kids, they didn't care if one or two went missing. I'm not suggesting that. But the phenomenon of overparenting, helicopter parenting, all that stuff we know about is now endemic in Western society, including Australia. But from the point of view of the theme of the new book, the point about a low birth rate is that one of the most effective social lubricants is now in shorter supply than it's ever been. Because kids operate in most neighbourhoods like social lubricants, don't they? The kids get to know each other playing in the street. They used to play in the street. Helicopter parents don't permit that. Or on the school bus or in the playground. Then the families get to know each other and gradually social connections are formed through neighbourhoods courtesy of the kids. Well, when the kids disappear, they're not playing in the streets and there aren't as many of them as there used to be, we have to compensate, and we are compensating. If you want to have a giggle sometime, take a look at these two graphs. The birth rate, steadily going down, the rate of dog ownership, steadily going up. This is the great substitute for children. And yes, there are some dogs in the new book, and there's a dog walking park in Southwood. And people do say, well, dogs are like, we're quite transparent. We've got the dog as a child substitute, and we do meet other people in the neighbourhood when we take the dog to the park, and the dogs all play together, and gradually the owners get to know each other. But because these dogs are typically child substitutes, the problem is people are now giving their dogs human names. So you're introduced to a dog and it's called Wendy or Nigel, and then you can't remember whether that's the dog or the owner. So when you go to the dog walking park, there is this moment of hesitation when you say, "Good morning, Wendy," and you're not sure what kind of response you'll get. That's what happens when the birth rate goes down, and that's has another obvious influence on our communities, as does, and perhaps you haven't thought of this before unless you live in one of these households, and then I'm sure you have thought of it, but the rise of the two-income household. This is a very recent phenomenon in Australian social life, and there are many factors that have contributed to it, but it's now the case that in almost all households where there are two adults living of working age, they are both working, at least part-time. And that is, of course, because our current material standard for Middle Australia is that you can't maintain the sort of standard of living you want without two incomes. So typically, we have the two-income household as the dominant household type. Fine. The problem, of course, is that the people who live in those two-income households are permanently worn out. They're very busy. When it comes to the weekend, they're catching up on household chores or doing the shopping or sleeping, and the time and energy that might once have been available in at least one of them for nurturing neighbourhood connections and for feeding the life of the community, engaging with the local community, that time and energy is not available in the quantities that it once was. And while we're talking about households, here's another radical change. I mean, this is another revolution in the structure of Australian society. It's been happening, it's been creeping up on us, but it's accelerated in the last 40 years, and that's the rise of the single-person household. In the last 100 years, Australia's population has increased fivefold, and the number of households in Australia has increased tenfold. In other words, our households have been getting steadily smaller and smaller. The average Australian household now contains 2.5 people, heading for the Bureau of Statistics, if they survive, tells us that we're heading for an average household of 2.2. And the single most common household type in Australia now is the single-person household. About 26 or 27% of all households contain just one person. If you put them together with two-person households, that's about, the combined total is about 53% of all Australian households. So if you live alone or just with one other person, then in terms of household demographics, you're positively mainstream. That's now the norm for Australian households. Here's an odd case. If you live in a household where you're living with the person that you are with a person you are married to, and it's the only person you've ever been married to, and you're currently living with 3 or more of your very own children and no one else's under the same roof, then you're now part of the eccentric fringe. And yet 40 years ago we would have said you were mainstream. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that 30% of Australians live alone. What it does mean, again, the ABS is predicting that within the next 12 years or so there will be 30% of households with just one person in them. There are still more people in larger households, of course, but in terms of households, that's the new Australia. You see the implications. The risk of people feeling isolated, feeling a bit alienated, lonely, the risk of these things is greater than it's ever been. And the responsibility on people who live in a street where there are single-person households, the responsibility to embrace them and bring them into the life of the community is correspondingly greater. I'll say a bit more about that later. Let me just quickly mention a couple of other factors that have been redefining us. Our mobility. We're now a society exactly like the US, where on average Australians move house once every 6 years. If you're still living in the house you've been living in for the last 30 years, and some of you probably are, imagine how often other people are moving to get the national average up to once every 6 years. And there's mobility in another sense, of course. We are now a car-driving society, which even 40 years ago was not nearly as true of us as it is today. We come and go, particularly in our suburbs, we come and go by car. Dramatic decline in footpath traffic. In fact, in many new developments, there are no footpaths because it's assumed that people will come and go by car. Well, we wave at a familiar car, assuming the neighbour is at the wheel, but that's not quite the same, is it, as saying g'day over the fence or on the footpath. And there is, of course, one other, I mean, there are many other things we could put on this, but one other obvious thing that has to go on this list, and I'm sure you're wondering why I haven't mentioned it already, and that's the information technology revolution, which has so radically changed the way we and people all around the globe now live and work and communicate and inform and entertain ourselves, courtesy of the internet revolution. It's far too soon. I've got a whole chapter on the subject of online communities in the new book. It's far too soon to make too many generalisations about what the impact of this will be on the way we live. People are endlessly doing research about it, and the research is very contradictory. You can prove almost anything you want to at the moment about the blessings or the curses of internet technology, but some things have become pretty obvious. One is that our notion of privacy and even our notion of identity has been radically changed by the IT revolution. You're probably aware of the fact, it'll be true of some of you here, that younger users of the internet, particularly the under 30s, typically have multiple online identities, often as many as 10 different identities online. 5 is common. So if you're going to fall in love on the internet, you'd better be fairly careful about who it is you're falling in love with. It may be someone who's constructed an identity to look attractive to someone like you. That kind of thing, as we know, goes on all the time. By the way, there is a little bit of research about what happens to people who fall in love on the net. Well, I find it encouraging, I hope you do. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, when those people who've had a passionate internet romance and have decided that their soulmate is out there in cyberspace, when they meet, in the overwhelming majority of cases, nothing happens. So it turns out that chemistry still does count, and you can't reproduce that digitally. So the concept of privacy, as I mentioned, has been radically challenged by the fact that so much is out there, that all this information is being exchanged about ourselves and each other and unable to eradicate. We have a rising generation of young people who come into society. We've just enacted a whole lot of privacy laws in the nick of time for a generation who could hardly care less about those privacy laws. And when their parents say to them, But, why are you putting all this stuff out there? You'll never be able to take it back. They simply shrug and say, so is everyone else. By the way, there is some recent research from Western Europe, which I've reported in the new book also, showing that among older adolescents and young adults, there has been a mass exodus from Facebook. And before you start cheering and saying, they've come to their senses, they've realised that they really need to spend more time with each other and not so much time on Facebook, not so fast. The reason they're deserting Facebook in such numbers is that their parents are on it. And the researchers in that particular study report that there comes this awful day for a young person when their mother asks if she can be a Facebook friend. That's the time to go to Tumblr or Instagram or something else. Well, look, it is a revolution. It's a revolution that has already blurred the tradition that the distinction that we traditionally made between communication and information transfer. We've always thought they were different, that communication was something we did like this, where we can look at each other and talk to each other and notice posture and gesture and facial expression and tone of voice, rate of speech, all of these things that contribute so richly to the nuances of meaning in a human encounter, all gone when we communicate or exchange data via the internet. We have ways of compensating, and it works better if it's with someone you know, but it does rather radically reframe our thinking about what communication really is. If we can now conceive of human communication not involving actual human presence, then this opens up a whole lot of questions about who we are and what human relationships and indeed what human communities really mean. Well, let me stop with all that and reflect on it for a few moments before we have a conversation about it. The cumulative effect of what I've been describing is pretty obvious, isn't it? If you put all that together, it suggests there will be a tendency for people to feel rather less engaged, rather less comfortable, rather less secure in their local neighbourhoods. And if they feel rather less secure, they will feel rather less trustful of their neighbours. Edith Cowan University, a couple of years ago, published what I think is one of the most chilling pieces of social research I've ever read. It was a national survey which drew the conclusion that only 35% of Australians say they trust their neighbours. What's going on with the other 65%? We know that's not the way we're meant to live. We know that denies our very DNA. We know that contradicts the ancient and contemporary best model of how human beings live, which is in communities where we do know each other, respect each other, and as far as possible, trust each other. The fact that that's been eroded on such a massive scale means, of course, that we try to compensate. One of the ways we compensate is we stick the name village on everything to try and pretend that it's working. So the local suburban shops will be the XYZ village. You couldn't possibly create a development for retired people to live without calling it a retirement village, as though that will somehow take the edge off what's really happening to them. You move into a high-rise apartment block and the developer's calling it a vertical village. Well, we know why we're clinging to this word village, because we know we're losing it. We know that unless we're very watchful, unless we're very vigilant, the very thing that makes us feel as if we belong, at least at the local level, is under threat. The other consequence of this, of course, is a bit of a paradox, and that is that when we begin to lose the sense of being connected with the neighbourhood, when we begin to feel a little less secure and a little less trustful, what happens? We become obsessed with our own privacy. We become very self-absorbed. We put bars on the windows and electrically operated gates, all these things that emphasise our individuality, our personal privacy and safety, rather than our sense of being part of a functioning community. All of this, of course, leads to a reinforcement of something that is another phenomenon of Australian society, Western society, over the last 30 or 40 years, and that has been the rise of what I think of now as certainly a deeply unhealthy but almost a grotesque obsession with me, with the idea of me, my happiness, my prosperity, my entitlements, my well-being. And yet everything we know about the psychology of human beings, ancient and modern, tells us that this quest for self-knowledge, this obsession with who am I and understanding myself and my personal identity is seriously misguided. That isn't the main quest for people who by nature are social creatures. The question is not who am I? The question is who are we? Are we creating the kind of village, neighbourhood, community, society that we want to live in? One of my psychological heroes, Carl Rogers, the famous American psychotherapist, now dead, but he's written some beautiful things about human nature. If you haven't read his collection of essays called On Becoming a Person, it's still in print. I recommend that you get hold of that, Carl Rogers, On Becoming a Person. But Carl Rogers wrote towards the end of his working life that when any of his clients came to a full understanding of who they are, it was to realise that they belong somewhere, that they are part of something, that they're in a family or a friendship circle or a network or a workplace community or a neighbourhood. But it's only through understanding that context that they get some sort of glimmer of who they are. We're fond of quoting the ancient Greeks on this subject, aren't we? Plato saying, "Know thyself," and we think that's an encouragement to navel-gazing. Well, life in ancient Athens wasn't like that. The ancient Greeks didn't have a word for what we would now call individualism. Know thyself meant you're a citizen of this city, know your place, know your duty as a citizen. When Aristotle wrote about happiness, they didn't write anything about our emotional state. They wrote all about fulfilling our destiny, discharging our civic duty, knowing our place in the Athenian society. That's what know thyself meant, and it's what it still means. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I quoted in the front of the new book, says, "We exist in a bundle of belonging," and that seems to me a very good summary. So if you acknowledge everything I've been saying, and I'll wrap this up very quickly so we've got time for some discussion, but if you acknowledge everything that I've been saying, surely there's a glaring implication, isn't there, which is that it's actually in this contemporary stage of our social evolution that we happen to be in, it's actually a bit harder for communities to function as stable and cohesive social units the way they used to. And what does that mean? Well, marriage is a bit harder to sustain than it used to be. Friendships are a bit harder to sustain for reasons like mobility and technology, etc. We know in all of those human settings, you have to compensate for the factors that would drive you apart. You have to work a little harder. And so we have to work a little harder at this business of belonging, at this business of engaging with local neighbourhoods and communities. How do we do that? Well, we rely on local government, we rely on commercial developers, urban planners, people responsible for the creation of local infrastructure, parks, paths, all of these things that create little places where we're likely to encounter each other. We rely on all of that to be done to make our neighbourhoods places where there are hubs where we're likely to go and congregate. It might be the library, it might be the shops, it might be the church, it might be the school, it might be the dog walking park. We need those facilities to facilitate our connectedness with each other. But the key factor, of course, is that we set about making it happen. There's this grandiose term that you hear a lot about in social analysis called social capital, and it sounds as though that's some grand thing that economists have dreamed up. Social capital, we know, makes a society strong, makes a community, a neighbourhood strong. Social capital is all just about acknowledging the role of human connection, of human life, and respecting that in each other. We build social capital not by doing some amazing thing. We build social capital by smiling at each other. We build social capital by remembering to say hello when you pass a stranger in your street, or when you're standing beside someone at a bus stop and it looks like rain. You build social capital by commenting on the fact that it looks like rain. This is not trivial stuff. These are how we create communities that function, and the sense not just of physical safety, which comes with a sense of familiarity, but also the emotional security that comes with the feeling that we belong here. This doesn't, of course, mean that local neighbourhoods and communities have to be populated by people who are enjoying intimate friendships with each other. Friends are different. We've got lots of roles to play at work, in the family, etc. And one of the roles that we have to play, because we're social creatures, is the role of neighbour. And if you're in doubt about how to play the role of neighbour, just look what happens when there's a catastrophe. Suddenly everyone knows how to be a neighbour. When there's a flood, or a bushfire, or a storm that unroofs houses in your street, or a bereavement, or a terrible accident, or something dramatic happens. We're all out, aren't we, being neighbours? The Queensland floods, the Brisbane floods a couple of years ago, busloads of total strangers coming in to Brisbane with mops and buckets to try and help out in a neighbourly way. We do that almost automatically when there's a crisis. How amazing that we don't invest in that before there's a crisis, so that we're much readier to respond when people need us. The good news about all this is that you can make it happen anywhere, even in a high-rise apartment block. The subtitle of the new book is, "It's not where you live, it's how you live." And a few years ago I was doing some research on this very subject, talking to people about why they live where they live. And all over Australia I was listening to people saying, well, you know, this is a great place to live. One that sticks in my mind particularly was a group of young mothers in the Sydney suburb of Mascot, hard by Sydney Airport, light industrial area. You'd say aesthetically a pretty unprepossessing sort of a joint, with jets thundering overhead. And those young women were saying, why would anyone ever want to live anywhere but Mascot? And it worked for them. They'd created a village. Their kids knew each other. They knew each other. They could rely on each other. And that was, to me, a dramatic example of how it's not where you live, it's how you live. Now, of course, we do belong to lots of other communities, not just the neighbourhood where we live, but there is something special. There is something potentially magical about our capacity as humans to get along with people who we wouldn't choose to live beside. Did you interview all the people in your street before you bought or rented the house you live in? I'll bet you didn't. You just moved in and hoped that it would work, and it probably works, or it certainly could work. The people next door might be of different religion, different politics, might raise their kids in a way you disapprove of. They don't have to be people you like, but you're sharing that space. You're part of a community, and your social maturity, and I go so far as to say your moral maturity, depends on being able to create a community out of people who wouldn't necessarily choose to share the same space. Now, let me conclude by just reading a paragraph from the postscript to the new book. Every community has its differences of opinion, its social divisions and its cultural tensions, which is simply to say that every community is both diverse and inescapably human. If you want to master the art of belonging, you'll need to accept the imperfections and deal with them. And the best way of dealing with them is to overlook them. There's a lot of tolerance, a lot of forgiveness in the art of belonging. So why would you do it? Why would you want to master the art of belonging? 3 reasons. First of all, the reward is that if you create a community where you know each other, you will feel physically safer and emotionally more secure. Second reason, as you get older, social interactions with neighbours, with people at the shops, the library, on the footpath, etc., will help to keep dementia at bay far more effectively than the daily crossword. And the third reason is that the way we create the communities, the local neighbourhoods that we live in, is actually determining the kind of society Australia will become. In the end, it seems to me, we only need to dream of the kind of society we would like to live in, and then live in our own street, operate in our own workplaces as though it is that kind of society. It starts in the street. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Hugh. That was absolutely fascinating. Now, I'm sure that we will have people who would like to join in. I can't actually see a lot, so would people like to wave if you'd like to ask a question? We've got roving mics. You better stand up or something so I can see you. In the meantime, Hugh, I think you led off housing design too easily. Don't you think the appalling modern design whereby we have a whole streetscape of tilt-up double garages where people drive in using their electronic clicker straight into their garage and then straight into their house is something that destroys the sense of community?
Yeah, absolutely, Ray. We haven't thought that through. There are a lot of things about our housing stock we haven't thought through. I mean, even the classic, what we call the quarter-acre block, it's usually a bit less than a quarter of an acre, designed for a way of life that we used to have. We no longer have that way of life, and we need to rethink that. Probably the ideal situation for humans is medium density housing. Less private backyards and so on, and more public space, more street life, etc. We achieve it in inner suburbs. We'll probably gradually transform our outer suburbs in that direction as well. But you're right, we've made terrible mistakes. Even the high-rise apartment block will come to be seen at some point in the future as just a mistake. That wasn't how humans would best live. If you pack them in as tightly as that, they will master the art of avoiding eye contact and become obsessed with their privacy. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you to remark on the meet-up groups as part of the development. Are they ways that people are actually increasing that social?
I missed the key word.
The meet-up groups. I'm just wondering if you would remark on those. And also, do you think that this sort of burgeoning of Airbnb is a part of people wanting to actually connect with others?
Yes, it's interesting. It sounds like a paradox that a lot of stuff is happening now courtesy of the internet that's actually facilitating contact. And things like there are a number of websites now that are designed to put you in touch with what's going on in your local community, whether it's events and activities or book clubs and other ways of connecting at a more personal level. And the Airbnb thing is a way of saying, yes, we'll try and operate on the vast scale of the internet as if we are going to be friends who trust each other. And there are some appalling disasters that result, but mostly it works beautifully. So yes, I think that's a very interesting early sign that we're trying to rethink our use of the internet to be more, to facilitate more personal reaction. The hazard is where we think that the internet itself will provide us with cyber communities that'll work just like other communities. And the evidence on that so far is not very encouraging. There are people who feel, people who are isolated and have some sort of online community, young mothers, carers, people in isolated regional areas and so on. It's certainly better than nothing and better than it used to be, but it's still a very poor substitute for face-to-face. And by the way, just a footnote to that, the research on what happens when people spend a lot of time trawling through the internet, Facebook, etc., is a bit discouraging. It does suggest that this has a rather depressing effect, particularly on young people, because everyone else seems to be having such a wonderful time. It's a bit like when you get those awful circular letters from other families at Christmas.
At least if your mum's on Facebook, not everyone's having a great.
Yeah, that's true.
Is it working? I recently read in a paper published some years ago that the advertising industry pays $100, it costs $100 for every man, woman and child in the universe, in the world. Do you think that this would have something to do with the me syndrome?
No question. This is a very sophisticated, very clever industry. It has an absolutely legitimate place in our society, but particularly over the last, again, this 30 to 40 year period, it has, because there's been a lack of other restraints, it has certainly fed our greed and the illusion that if only we could have this and this and this and more of this and this and this, we would be better people and happier and all of that. We know it's a hoax, but we keep falling for it. And we fall for it partly because it doesn't feel like a hoax in the beginning. Retail therapy works, but it only works for about 48 hours. A new car does transform your life for about a month, and then it's an old car. So that's what feeds the beast. We keep being seduced by that idea. I think the twin seducers that have distracted us from the idea of goodness in our lives, that's the theme of my previous book, The Good Life, and distracted us from the need to nurture our communities. The twin seducers have been materialism, fed by mass marketing, and the happiness industry, which has fed us this idea that my personal happiness is kind of my birthright, and if I'm not feeling happy, there's something wrong, and I'd better get happy. Well, that's not what human life is like, and I think seduced is the right word.
Hello, Hugh. My name actually is Nigel, by the way. I was a high school teacher for 35 years, and some years ago we used to teach with the Year 10s a book called The Shirley by Darcy Nyland about a itinerant worker who travels Australia. I suppose he'd be called Fofo now, fly up. And one of the things, there's a great line in the book where he's offered the SUSO, the sustenance payment, which used to be the predecessor to the unemployment benefit,
yes.
Now New Start. And he says, I won't take a bob I haven't earned myself. A bob, I think most people here know it's a shilling, or basically I won't take money I haven't worked for. Yes. And I gave the kids a question, and I said, how does Darcy Nyland want us to see the character of Macaulay in this? And I was expecting, he's a proud man who doesn't want to take charity, who is independent. And one child wasn't deliberately doing a counterintuitive reading or divergent reading. He just said, the author wants us to see him as an idiot because the government's offering the money, why doesn't he take it?
Yeah.
And that was his deliberate. And all the other kids were nodding in agreement. That's stupid. And I was wondering, are kids now, perhaps, do you think, changing? They read not just literature but our history completely differently to the way we even expect. It was a surprise to me in the class. And I couldn't help thinking now that the story about a man taking a little girl in remote areas would have got a lot of other undesirable attention as well. But at the time in the classroom, it didn't even occur to me that would be another reading of the book. But
yes.
Nowadays, you couldn't escape it.
Yes, I'm sure Darcy Nyland would be horrified. I'm sure your interpretation was the Nyland interpretation of that story. But it's a very interesting observation, and we've got to be a bit wary about making generalisations that are too big here, but there is no doubt. I mean, this tells us two things. First of all, readers will interpret books any way they like, so once you've given birth, you've just got to let it go. The other thing it's telling us is that social attitudes on this subject have changed very radically, and we are at a stage where it's much more likely that people will say, I'm entitled to everything I can get, regardless of the common good. Let me give you another example from very recent economic history, and that's the phenomenon of carers' leave. Now, carers' leave is a wonderfully compassionate innovation for people who are really stuck with having to care for a sick partner or child or something, and they have to have a time off work and they should be compensated. Carers' leave, in the minds of many people, has now become another entitlement. I'm going to have a week's carers' leave because I'm entitled to it, and what I'm caring for is often very dubious. Like sick leave. Sick leave is an entitlement if you're sick. Increasingly it becomes an entitlement. Oh, I haven't used all my sick leave. I'd better have a week's sick leave before we go into the next year. This is a strange mentality, which is a grotesque misinterpretation of welfare, which should be offered in a civil society to people who need that support. I'm in favour of us being as generous as possible to people who are unemployed, sick, marginalised in any way, or trapped as carers, all those things. But we have to be very careful that we don't allow that to become a sense of entitlement for everyone, and you're a mug if you don't take it. This is a real degradation of the benefit.
Yes. I just wanted to, Daniel Goleman, in his book Social Intelligence, talks about the fact that we're wired to connect. Neuroscience says that.
Yes, yes.
What I'm interested in is the fact that young people are not learning to interact. So we're not giving them the skills to talk to the neighbour. We're not giving them those skills where parents would have friends over for a barbecue and they'd learn the social graces that they would normally learn. We're not teaching our young people how to do that. In fact, we stopped doing that quite a few years ago. I just wondered what your thoughts are on how that is impacting on our ability to interact socially in most situations.
Yes, thank you for that. That's another very thoughtful question. And again, I'd just caution us against making too much of a generalisation about this, because there are, of course, many wonderful parents who do take all of this training very seriously, who teach their kids manners, who do have friends around and teach their kids to look people in the eye and say hello. But you're right in the general point that there is some decline in this, though we have to remember that it still happens in the playground, and so kids do learn to interact. Another very sad piece of research, which I conducted myself a number of years ago, was into exploring the motivations that people have for sending their children to private schools. And I was shocked by the conclusion that came out of that. Overwhelmingly, people said they send their kids to private schools for them to learn values and discipline. The two things that I would have thought were the classic parental responsibility, and now increasing. Well, in New South Wales, it's now a majority of secondary school kids who are in private schools. Just in the last 12 months, we crossed the 50%. So that's a symptom of what you're saying. Let's leave it to the school. And that's a tragedy. Part of my appeal for us to be more concerned about the life of the local neighbourhood is exactly that when we are interacting, when we're teaching our kids to say hello to the old lady who lives at the end of the street, and not to be scared of her because we don't know her, we'll again be raising kids who have not just some social confidence and some social competence, but that they will recognise that neighbours are neighbours, and that I am a neighbour and I've got some responsibility to these people. Yeah, we've got to spell all this stuff out now. It used to be obvious.
And culturally as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. Stranger danger is one of the huge problems that we've introduced. And I'm not, of course, suggesting that kids don't have to be aware of potential hazards, but stranger danger has created a generation of kids who think strangers are dangerous rather than people to greet.
I'm here, Hugh. I'm over here.
Sorry, can you wait? Oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you for all your insights and analyses, which I happen to agree with. My question is, where to from here? We have an auditorium full of people who are probably going to go away with new insights and things to think about, but there's over 20 million people out there. It's going to take more than people here to change things. Where to from now with what you have told us about in the analyses?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Our time's just about gone. This is probably the last question. It's a perfect question to end with because there's a slightly bleak edge to your question, a slight despair. And let me encourage you to think in precisely the opposite way. If everyone in this auditorium left saying, actually, I don't know my neighbours and I should go and knock on the door and say hi, just want you to know who I am, that would be a big start. I think there's no magic wand. We can bleat about the state of the nation, about the way society is being degraded. There is actually only one way. I mean, some people do heroic things that capture the imagination of an entire population, but for most of us, there is only one way to encourage the turning of the tide, and that is where you work, where you live. Do it, manage it the way you think it should be managed, and your example does count. The ripples do go out. This many people, through the multiplier effect of social influence, could have an enormous impact on the life of the streets, the suburbs in Perth where most of us live. So I'd encourage you not to say, gosh, this is all too hard, but instead to say, we see a problem looming here and the solution is actually my solution. And for me, it's quite easy to do what I know needs to be done. Sorry, yes, by all means.
Hugh, something warm and fuzzy. I hope you noticed from the Southern Highlands in New South Wales that about a week ago we had 2 gigantic French persons traipsing the streets of inner Perth. The crush was unbelievable. The level of manners and civility was extraordinary. On buses, trains, down here by the river, you couldn't move, but people didn't bug you. Yes. They didn't swear and try to hit you or run over you. Yeah. They actually smiled and said, step here instead. 99-year-old grandmas on wheelie frames giving way to me. And I had... There's something remarkable happened for 3 whole days and it sucked about 1.5 million people into densely packed streets.
Yeah.
So what... That's my little rave, but there's a question, how can you tap the inherent possibilities of an event like that, which is about cultural capital, to keep it going among us forever?
Yes. Look, this question needs to be bracketed with the previous question because the answer is really the same. But that's a lovely example. And I mean, the same thing happened in Sydney when the Olympic Games were on. Everyone was suddenly charming to everyone and friendly and smiling. Train crews on the suburban rail network would say, it's amazing, everyone's talking to each other. And then as soon as the Olympics were over, the newspapers went up again and they all stopped talking. And people were saying exactly what you're saying. How can we bottle this spirit of the people that was so obvious when there was a special event? It happens when there's a terrible crisis, and it happens when there's a major cultural event where we all feel as though we're connected through the symbolism of the Giants or the Olympics or whatever it might be. We've just got to recognise that there's no reason for me or you to let that go. If we think that it's still important to chat to the person beside us, the stranger beside us on the train or the bus, well, then we should do it, even if the starting point has to be, weren't the Giants fantastic? And they said, what are the Giants? Oh, I remember they were here last week. Oh, yeah.
Okay,
keep the momentum going.
Regrettably, we are out of time. Obviously, learning the art of belonging is something that's very important for all of us. I think, Hugh, the people here from Southwood have been fantastic in their participation. So after this, please take yourselves over to the Dimmock's bookshop in the Undercroft. On your way, buy Reality, my book, then go immediately to see Hugh Mackay, who will be signing all of his books. And now, please join me in welcoming the fantastic Hugh Mackay.